technically pests include diseases, but I think most of us, when we hear pest, we think of like insect pests. But so I kind of use it that way while I'm talking here, insect and disease pests. And I'm pretty informal, so please do throw out questions as we go. And I probably, knowing that I got some of the results of what people were interested in hearing about, so I tried to throw some of those in, but hopefully I'm not going to go too long, so I better get moving. Uh, so when we're talking about our pests, whether they're insects or diseases, it's really important to know their life cycle. And we're going to get back to this probably a couple times. Like, what is the biology of the actual pest that we're talking about? So, in general, we're thinking, in the winter months, we're almost out of this. These pests or these diseases are just trying to survive somewhere. Is that in crop debris? So, is that going to be in your garden next year where it was last year? Is that somewhere far away down south because it can't overwinter here and it shows up later? So at any rate, somehow it survived and it shows up at some point. Some of them in the spring, some not until later. And they're doing their initial infecting or infesting, and then they are growing while our crops are growing. Maybe they're reproducing a couple times. Maybe there's a couple generations, if it's an insect pest, particularly. And diseases, that's how they spread. They just reproduce. And then at some point, they got to go dormant. And so, depending on the pest or the disease, we maybe have different points along that life cycle where we're trying to interrupt it, mess with it, or avoid it. The other idea that I'm gonna try to, you're gonna see this pop up again a couple times. This is called the disease triangle. I'm saying it's also the pest and disease triangle. And it's the idea that you really need three things for these problems to show up. You need a susceptible host, your tomato plant or whatever, a conducive environment when it's too humid or too rainy for too long, or it's warm enough for whatever pest, insect to really go crazy. And you need that pathogen or that pest to be present. So if there's no late blight in the area, you don't need to go spray for late blight. But if there is late blight in the area, then you need to pay attention to is the environment conducive? Could it actually take hold? Are you growing a resistant crop or one that's susceptible? Things like that. So this triangle is going to pop up again. And then overall, oh yeah, so we'll start with the susceptible host. So this will anchor us as we go through what I am going to talk about as sort of the hierarchy of like organic disease and pest management and control. So your first step is really when you're talking about what are you growing and trying to not have a susceptible host, to have a strong resistant host. So as an example, I grabbed a screenshot or a scan of the Johnny's catalog a couple years ago. And we'll say that we're trying to look for what cabbage seed are we going to get. We'll zoom right in here. They list all of their disease resistance codes. And you can see down at the bottom of that red box, there's HR for high resistance, IR for intermediate resistance. So let's say we've had black rot as a disease that we've identified in the past, and it does happen to some cabbages. Well, then you should probably be looking for a cabbage that has at least some resistance to black rot. So this one that we've circled here, the name of the variety is Capture. Um, and it has intermediate resistance to black rot. So right off the bat, you have a much better chance of a good crop and not really dealing with this pest, especially where we are further north. We don't have black rot as big of a deal as they do in the south. It's a bacterial disease. It really thrives in the heat. So if you've had it show up and you have at least intermediate resistance, you're probably in the clear. You've probably done all you need to do for that one pest for that one crop. So here's where we're going to start to see, you'll see this list continue as I go, the hierarchy of what is our strategy for disease and pest management. So that's healthy crops. That includes with disease resistance, but it also includes just their vigor, their overall nutrition. Do you have good, healthy soil that is feeding good, healthy crops. And those good, healthy crops are going to be stronger and more resilient, and better able to fight off things or grow through them. And then we can kind of get into the pathogen presence or the pest presence. Is it there or not? That's one of the reasons why we are often talking about crop rotation. It's a little harder on the garden scale. Oftentimes it may not even make sense. You know, if you're trying to rotate because of an insect pest and that insect pest flies, you're never going to rotate away from it in a home garden, right? You just can't get far enough away. On a commercial farm, you know, maybe they have a field that's down the road half a mile, then that's an amazing rotation. You can really get far away from things. But when we're talking about things that overwinter in the soil, whether that's an insect pest or a disease, you don't want to plant the same kind of family, crop family right there. And to think about crop families, please don't try to read this. It's way too big, but this is a chart just kind of showing like all the different plant families. So up top are the monocots, the grasses, onions, corn, very, very different plants than dicots, which are our broadleaves. You know, that's everything else we like. So, you know, our onions, our garlic, that's way up there. Very, very differently, very unrelated to, say, brassicas or beets or nightshades or carrots. All these are different crop families. So you can't use this to get away from every disease and every pest. Some of them feed on all sorts of different plants. They don't care what plant it is, right? There's white mold is a common disease that will happily feed on lots of different plants. It doesn't really care what family they're in. But some of them are specialists. So, you know, if we're talking about Brassica downy mildew, well, the name gives it away. It's only going to infect brassicas. So the more you can rotate things, even just as a best insurance, it's cheap insurance. If you've got the flexibility, if you can move your crops, you know, you grew tomatoes here this year, and now you grow them over there. You're just it's not that hard to move where you plant something, and you get to reduce your risk pretty easily. But it's not just about in space. So like tomatoes, you do plant them in one spot, they grow there all year, and that's it until the next year. Then you're going to move them in space over in across different growing seasons. But you also need to think about it in time. Um, and then another thing to think about in terms of that pest presence is good weed control, for a couple reasons. The first one is that when we're talking about crop rotation, it's not just your crop, it's also your other plants that are growing in the same spot. So here's a pest. I don't know how often you see it up in the county, but I know we have folks from different parts of Maine. Um, this is spinach leaf miner. And you see in this picture, you can see two of its life stages. There's the egg right down here. These white, almost look like little teeth on that leaf, on the underside of the leaf. Those hatch, the pupa goes in and tunnels through the two layers of a leaf. And it makes it really gross. You don't want to eat it. And it's really difficult for commercial farmers because nobody's going to want to buy it. You absolutely could eat it if you wanted to. But what happens is this pupa, see, there's a nice big one in the middle of that lower leaf. Um, Once it's gotten big enough, it will chew its way back out of the leaf and it will drop into the soil. Sorry, that's a larvae. And then it will turn into a pupa in the soil and it'll pupate. And then it emerges as an adult. And the adult is a fly. And it's essentially indistinguishable from any other fly, for me at least. I think a true expert could tell it apart, but I couldn't. Um, so how do you rotate away from this? Why does it matter? Uh, and here's the other thing is that is a weed, lamb's quarters. And look, it has a leaf miner growing in it. So it's very closely related to spinach. There's a good chance that if you have lamb's quarters growing where you had spinach, the leaf miner can survive in there. The leaf miner has multiple generations in a season. So you have an infested spinach crop. You know there's leaf miner in there. Um, you can do what you can do. Some of them are going to get by you no matter what. There are different things you can do to control. Uh, However, you don't want to plant your spinach there next. You don't want to plant your fall spinach in that same spot, do you? Because you may have some pupae that are in the soil and they're going to emerge right there. So even if you were going to put row cover or exclusion netting on your next planting of spinach, if you put it in the same spot where those suckers are living in the soil, and that's how they overwinter as pupae in the soil. So if you don't rotate your spinach, even if you do the covering, that would keep the adult fly out so they could never lay their eggs. But if you didn't rotate, then that adult fly emerges underneath the cover, and you've in fact just created like a little hotel for them. So it has to be, you have to think through some of the biology of the pest you're thinking about and how that affects these different moments when you might be able to influence things. Good sanitation is always important. Um, Here's an example of just early blight in tomatoes. I bet everybody's seen something like this. The way that this disease overwinters is those little infected portions of leaf. And yeah, you want to remove as much of that plant out of your garden as you can. But of course, bits of that dead dry leaf are going to fall away. And that's where that disease overwinters. And that's early blight, not late blight. They're different. So the more thoroughly you can remove that plant tissue and then also address the fact that you now have these little bits of dead leaves that you could never pick up by hand. It would be crazy. You could maybe rake, you could maybe leaf blow, you could, um, this is for folks who are comfortable doing tillage in their garden. This is why burying and doing some tillage in the spring is maybe helpful because it's burying that, it's incorporating it, getting it to break down a little bit faster, decompose. For folks who aren't doing tillage, then maybe they're top dressing with compost and they're burying it that way. And that way that diseased leaf tissue is going to break down a lot faster and be composted in place essentially. So that's one way to also think about sanitation. It's not just about removing dead plant tissue. It's also about getting it to break down quickly or sequestering it somehow, getting it so that it's buried. Um, Here's squash bug, probably a familiar villain for many gardeners. This is one where sanitation really matters because it overwinters as an adult in the crop debris. And so if you can just get rid of that crop debris, throw it into the compost. If you have a burn pile, maybe consider burning it if you've been dealing with them. If you haven't been dealing with them, then it's not a big deal. But for folks who just kind of throw it off to the edge and then leave it in the woods or something, well, that's a nice little hotel for these guys, and they're going to come back the next year. They might come back anyway from your neighbors because they do fly, but you want to do anything to reduce that population because some percentage of them are going to die over winter, and you'd really rather deal with two of them showing up in the spring instead of 20, right? So anything you can do to get that population down is going to help. Then the next thing on our hierarchy is sort of barriers. And I already mentioned them a little bit, but row covers, exclusion netting. This might be a familiar pest for folks, the striped cucumber beetle. Or if you never really paid attention to it, but you've seen your squash plants, maybe your cucumber plants do this over on the right, that's bacterial wilt. So that's a crop disease. But the way you control that disease is you prevent the cucumber beetle because the cucumber beetle is almost always the way that disease spreads. And if you can keep the cucumber beetle population down or at bay, then you almost never see bacterial wilt. And similarly, folks maybe have seen squash vine borer. One of the most uh, frustrating pests, I think, for the garden because you only need one and it can completely, decapitate your plant like you see in this picture. Um, so both that and the cucumber beetle, if you have exclusion in place, some sort of barrier, exclusion netting, uh, row cover, floating row cover, remay, people call them different things. But anything to keep the adults that fly and move around from landing and laying their eggs, for as long as possible. You let your plant get a lot bigger. It's going to be more resilient. Maybe for your winter squash, it has had a chance to vine and reroot. So even if the stem gets eaten over here, then maybe the plant still survives. You still get a crop. Um, the trick, of course,
Caleb, can I
yeah.
ask a question? Just because we had so many people who said that cucumber beetles were a problem for them. Um, are there any sort of traps that work well, or like a clay that you can put on your crop, or anything
So,
other than the physical barrier, I guess, of an
yeah. Well, I will say first off, if you can get the barrier, that's your best control and the most important, because everything else is going to be this as long as it's, this is my own garden. I threw a couple of rocks in there. It's not even like tightly there, but it's enough to keep them out. And I leave it in place. The problem with this crop is that, of course, that they need to be pollinated. You need that pollen to go from the male flower to the female flower. So some folks will just wait until they see flowers and they'll take the cover off. And at that point, they're counting on the fact that they have a bigger plant that's more resilient to that bacterial disease. The youngest plants, if they get bitten by the cucumber beetle, they get the disease, those are like for sure dead. But if the plant has had a chance to make three, four true leaves, it's already become a lot more resistant. Um, what I will actually do, and I'm mid coast, so I'm maybe further south than some of the gardeners in the call. So maybe that's why I can get away with this, but I will let the first batch of flowers go by. I'll pay attention. I'll look, are they male flowers, female flowers? Because if it's just male flowers, for one thing, why uncover? The male flowers don't give you any squash fruit. Then the female flowers show up. I will let those go, the first ones go unpollinated, and then I get an even larger, for winter squash anyway, I get an even larger plant that is even more resilient, less susceptible to disease, and also when you then uncover for that second flush of female flowers, there's a lot more of them. And so instead of one big fruit and then maybe a couple that maybe make it to maturity, maybe don't, you get maybe three or four that get to maturity. But it's a little bit of a gamble depending on your growing season. However, once you uncover, now what do you do, right? Because they're still going to show up, most likely. So you mentioned a clay spray, and there is a product called Surround, and it's kaolin clay, and that can be sprayed on, and it's a deterrent. When they walk on it, they can't really sense it being like the cucurbit plant that they want to eat. Um, there are some traps. They're not highly effective, but the beetles are very attracted to the color yellow. That's why if you go out in your summer squash and your zucchini to pick in the morning, you'll find them all right there in those yellow flowers. Um, so you could experiment with that. I think for a home gardener, you might have just as much success going out with a high-powered battery vacuum of some sort and just try to suck them out of there, and get as many as you can as you go. I've tried it with a little electric bug zapper racket that you can get at like Job Lots or something. And while that's entertaining, it is probably not super effective or like worth my time. It is, you do get to feel a little bit like you're getting some revenge. And then if all that fails and they're still wreaking havoc, you can, for a lot of the beetle pests, the organic pesticide that would be used would be pyganic. It's a pyrethrin, it's a flower extract. But even though it comes from plants and it's organic approved, it's still kind of nasty. And I try to not use it if I don't have to, because it kills anything it comes in contact with in the insect world. So that includes your beneficial insects. Squash vine borer is even harder. They get into the stem, and like nothing you can spray is really going to do anything. Uh, and so that gets into a bit of life cycle stuff. So like they also overwinter in the soil. Some people I had a farmer friend who said he accidentally never got around to taking the tarp. He used tarping to kill things in his fields. And so he never took the tarp off of his old squash field. And then when he did, by like late June, maybe even July, he found a bunch of dead squash vine borer adults, the moths, because they had emerged, got stuck under the tarp, and couldn't find his crop. Did he get rid of all of them? No, there's probably some that had gone underground, like slightly off the field edge, and they're moths, they fly. But if you get the ones that are in your area, um, you're going to have much lower population and much less of a problem. The other thing that people can do, I like to make this recommendation. I don't know if anybody ever takes me up on it, is find a gardening friend that doesn't live right next to you and say, you grow the winter squash this year, I'll grow the onions, and we'll split the harvest, right? Because if you can skip a plant family for an entire growing season, all the pests that you've been having a population build up around you have suddenly been starved and their population will hopefully have crashed. So it can really help you reduce your thing. And that's then you're sort of mimicking like a commercial farmer that is maybe rotating between fields that are very far away. Uh, Row covers exclusion netting, also really good for our brassica pests. And why I really like it for brassicas is that I can't really think of most of the brassica crops we grow, almost none of them do we care if they get pollinated. So you can leave this row cover on year round. And I do that for kale. I have exclusion netting. It's a little bit tougher than regular row cover. So I keep off all my caterpillar pests because the moths can't land on it. I keep off cabbage maggot because the adult flies can't find it and lay eggs. And I also exclude porcupines, which are my biggest pest of my kale in my garden. And so anything to keep the critters out. And when I want to go harvest or go check on the weeds, I pull the cover up, I take what I need, and I put the cover back down, and I can leave it there as long as I want, as long as it's big enough to still cover the plants. Um, so it's crop specific, how you're going to use it, maybe, things like that. But if you can afford it, I don't know anybody that's ever regretted it, except for just the fact that nobody likes more plastic in the garden. So then I brought this up already, but we'll put a little finer point on it. Know what you have. What are we dealing with? And what is this pathogen? And anybody familiar with this? I'm just gonna, for the interest of time, I'm gonna assume you all said, oh yeah, I've seen that. What is disease is that? Because I do get pictures of this as a disease often. And it is not a disease. It is blossom end rot. It's an abiotic disorder. This is what it looks like in peppers. Can get confused for sunburn in peppers. And what happens is the plant is growing faster than it can move calcium. And it's not that you don't have calcium in the soil, it's just that you have a very vigorous plant. It's moving really fast, might be hot and humid, so it's not moving as much water because of that humidity. And the water flowing through the plant is how it moves calcium. So it gets a little tricky, but all right, well, there's no reason to spray anything on this. You can't you can't spray away blossom end rot. You just kind of wait for the plant to get a little healthier. You make sure that you're maintaining soil moisture, and a bigger plant can usually support the fruit better. But here, I don't know if you can see it over the Zoom, but maybe the photo on the right, you can see how it's that onion leaf is a little fuzzy down at the bottom. That's onion downy mildew. So that is very much a disease, and the way you're going to manage it is going to be very specific. I'm not going to go too deep into detail here unless people have had to deal with it before, and then we can talk about it later. How about this? Disease, what were we talking about? I see a crinkled brown potato leaf. I see beans with yellowing at the margins and maybe some browning. Not actually a disease. Not an abiotic disorder, though. This is leafhopper burn. So that's potato leafhopper. And when these little jerks show up, they feed on the plant and they suck out some nutrients. And at the same time, they're injecting a toxin. And the plant sends that toxin to its leaf edges, and they crisp up, they brown, they die. And that's the plant trying to stay alive. Eventually, you can just like completely lose potatoes, strawberries, beans if their pressure is really high. Luckily, this is not one that overwinters here. They overwinter down like the Gulf of Mexico. So how bad you have it in any given year usually has to do with when they caught a storm system and came up north again. Where they landed, I have talked with a potato grower that uh, further up north in Aroostook, and he says he's never seen them. But down in the southern part of the state, you get leaf hoppers sometimes in May, and it can be a real pain in the neck. This is one where we would go back to like choose a resistant variety, especially for potatoes. Some of them are more resistant to what we call hopper burn, which is just like, yeah, the leaf hopper may show up, they might feed on the plant, and there might be a tiny yield loss that you probably won't even notice. The real damage is if those leaves get crinkled, because then they can't photosynthesize. Um, if you have a plant that just doesn't do that, when it's like resistant to the toxin, you're essentially in the clear. And there's maybe some beans that are a little more resilient to that or not, and it's one that people will do some exclusion for. This was a farmer who called me out, and I checked. I couldn't figure it out from the photo, so I came to his field there and checked it out. I finally figured out that these white flecks on his garlic and also a bunch of other crops, not just the one crop family, were all on one side, one direction. And so this was just like hail. It was like a really bad storm, really hard driving rain. So it's a potential disease risk. Um, Purple blotch, some of the other onion allium diseases really like damaged tissue to that's their gateway into the plant. So if it was somebody who's really worried, they would maybe want to spray a protective fungicide, a biofungicide, maybe beneficial bacteria or something like copper if there was a stretch of wet weather coming and they had lots of reasons. They thought the disease was in the area, this wounding made the pest susceptible, and the conditions were about to be very favorable to disease. They might want to spray a fungicide as a preventative because all of our disease sprays don't cure things. They only prevent things pretty much. So it's only going to be beneficial if it's applied before the problem. However, most home gardens, your garlic, if it gets by this point, it's already a pretty big plant. It could probably get a little diseased on the leaves and it probably wouldn't affect the yield that much. So that's another thing to keep in mind through all of this conversation. If your plants are already big and you have some striped cucumber beetle, but the plants are big enough that they're not going to suffer the wilting, you probably don't need to spray to control them because they're probably not going to kill your crop. You might want to think about what you're doing in terms of their population building up over time. But at that point, if you've been able to exclude them long enough, you've done it. So in this case, there's a little bit of wounding. If those leaves got a foliar disease, is it really going to be a problem? Probably not unless you're pretty early in the season. So it depends on your situation, your pest, your crop, the time of the year, the conditions, etc., when these things are even worth doing. Um, Here's another funny one, not actually disease. Clearly, I was throwing a lot of these out here as tricks, right? Um, this is just from somebody curing their garlic on a greenhouse ground cloth that was black fabric inside a greenhouse, and they didn't realize how hot it was going to get. So if you let garlic get really hot, you get this, and it's called waxy breakdown, and it's totally abiotic. So when you see a critter, is it a pest? How bad will that damage be? Is it worth controlling? In this instance, that one looks pretty spooky, but that's actually a spiny soldier beetle, or I forget the full name, spined soldier beetle. That thing loves to eat other bugs, including Colorado potato beetles. So you want that one. This little waspy looking thing is a syrphid fly. Um, Totally beneficial. They pollinate. They have larvae that crawl around and eat up aphids like nothing else. There's good as lady beetle larvae. And then we get into like some in between territory. That's a golden tortoise beetle. Really pretty. They really only feed on the morning glory family. So your morning glory flowers, if you get holes in the leaves, probably these guys. And similar if you're growing sweet potatoes, they might start eating those. Are they going to do enough damage to actually impair your morning glories flowering or your sweet potatoes making a crop? almost never. Maybe morning glories if you've got a huge population and they're skeletonizing the leaves, and it's really bugging you and it's in front of your house. Okay, sure. And one quick spray would probably knock these all the way back, or hand removal or hitting them with a vacuum cleaner. But most of the time, you would maybe do one hand removal and you would never see them again or whatever. And they're so cool. So it matters, what are you dealing with? What's your pest? Is it actually going to impact your cropping? Is it going to really be a problem? If it is going to be a problem, where does it overwinter? What's its life cycle like? How can we interfere with that to keep those populations from getting really high? So we kind of like think back to that thought process there. And so to address that, here's my shameless plug. You can look at MOFGA or you can just Google MOFGA pest report. This is, and it doesn't have to be this one, but I'm saying this because this is the one that I put out. There are lots of IPM newsletters or email newsletters that go out. So I send out emails twice every 2 weeks throughout the growing season that talks about the pests that we know are coming, that people, extension folks that I talk to in Connecticut or Massachusetts say, oh yeah, we just saw our first batch of potato leafhoppers. Then I can put in the next pest report, potato leafhoppers found in Massachusetts, start looking now or be prepared to exclude them if that's what you're doing. And then also on our website there, we have the fact sheets that get linked to in those emails. So you can kind of look into what are those life cycles. I mentioned downy mildew in onions. I wasn't going to go into it because if you really want to go into it, go to this fact sheet, foliar diseases of alliums, and I think it's in that one. And if it's not, let me know and tell me that there's more that we need to do. Um, the idea being that you just need to know what's around. You need to be able to identify things. You don't need to know all of it, but like, what do you see? You need to be able to maybe, if you're growing a lot of squash and cucumbers, know the big pests. Know what squash bug looks like, cucumber beetle, squash vine borer, and that's about it. Those are the major insect pests of that crop of those crops. You don't have to know every single bug and beetle. Those ones I just showed, it's okay to not know them. Know the pests and maybe learn one new one every year, right? And then just know if you don't know it, don't assume it's bad. Don't go crazy spraying. Okay, then back to our idea of like what's our pest triangle? What can we do? Where can we apply those controls? So we can make a big, we can tweak things with our susceptible host or not. Do we have good soil health? Do we have a good resistant variety? Are we, yeah, so how susceptible is it? Then we're going to know, is the disease or the insect pest in the area? Um, or have I dealt with it in the past and I know it overwinters here, so we know we have that pathogen presence or not? That's often not in your control. And then the last thing that's still in your control is, do you have a conducive environment for that pest to really get a hold? So botrytis is a very common disease, often called gray leaf mold or gray mold rather. Um, and it infects lots of different crops. So you can't rotate your crops to get away from it. It also kind of overwinters almost everywhere. So it's around. But your entire garden doesn't go down to gray mold every year. The gray mold spores, the botrytis spores, require 8 to 12 hours of actual leaf wetness or really high humidity, something above 93%. And the temperatures have to be between 55 and 75. So if you are a greenhouse grower and you could control that greenhouse and keep it the temperature above 75, you almost never get gray mold, just because the disease can't really, it doesn't, those conditions don't favor the disease. It's not a conducive environment. Easier maybe to control the humidity, right? Like, do you have fans? Do you have airflow? And in our garden, we can't control whether it's going to rain for 8 to 12 hours or not, but we can maybe make our gardens more conducive to drying, facilitate better airflow and rapid drying of the conditions. Because the other thing, if it is raining for 8 hours, and a botrytis spore lands on a plant, it doesn't matter if it landed there in the first hour because 7 hours of rain are going to wash it away. Uh, what matters is how long that plant stays wet when the rain stops. So to think about that, our diseases, we have fungi example on the left, bacteria on the right. How are they actually infecting our plants? So if there's a wound, demonstrated by like this kind of gap in the cells, you see a spore on the left growing its mycelium that penetrate the plant, or bacteria. Notice how it's in like a film of water. Bacteria absolutely need water, and they're just reproducing and streaming into the plant. We also have stomata. Those are the little tiny leaves, holes in the bottoms of leaves that plants use to exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen and how they breathe, essentially. Here's a cool scanning electron micrograph. Like this is actually looking at the holes that plants breathe out of on the bottom of their leaves. And you can see something crawling into that one. And here's more of a close-up shot. So that fungi has germinated. It's sending mycelia out over the leaf surface, but it can't penetrate that waxy leaf surface until it finds an opening, in this case. So not much you can do there, but I can't not share that because I just think it's too cool. Uh, Hydothodes. If you've ever walked out and seen the morning dew on the grass, most of the time that's not morning dew. It didn't come from the air. That does happen for sure. But if you look at this picture of, see these um, big things of water, big balls of water at the drip tips on the leaves, those little spots, there's actually a bit of the physiology of a plant leaf because they are absorbing water and they're built to move water when it's sunny, right? When it's sunny, water is going from the roots up through that plant nonstop, and it is probably running out of water if it's photosynthesizing a lot on a hot sunny day. Um, and then night falls, and suddenly it has almost zero demand for that water, zero ways to get it away. And it can actually build up so much pressure that the cells in the plant burst. So instead of letting that happen, they push the water out these drip tips. And we talked about, here's black rot. Here's a picture of black rot. And the classic symptoms of black rot is that it starts on the leaf edges of brassicas. It's often V-shaped, coming in their veins because it hits that water on those hydothodes and gets in the heat of the day comes, the sun comes up, the plant needs water again. It actually sucks that water back in through those holes. And if bacteria have gotten in there, they go nuts. So, do most people have black rot? Maybe not, but there are other bacteria diseases you can get. And just as a general rule, because fungi could also get through that same water going back into the leaf, uh, don't walk around and brush up against plants early in the morning when they're still wet with the dew, because it's probably not dew and it's probably going to get sucked into the plant. And even if it is dew, you are vectoring diseases from plant to plant to plant as you walk along. So if you had a cabbage that looked like that, that might still actually make an okay cabbage. You don't necessarily have to remove it, but just know it's coated in bacteria that if you walk and get it onto another brassica plant, you might infect it. Another way that you can think about that is when you're working through one crop, it's just a good idea to go from the healthiest looking plants and work your way down to the least healthy looking plants at the end of the day, so that when you come back the next day, you've washed, you've showered, you've maybe put on a fresh pair of clothing, and that's not going to be the be all and end all if you ever spread disease, but it helps. It's cheap insurance. Why not do it? It's just good best practice. And then our last way that these diseases get in is direct penetration, and only fungi can do this. Bacteria can't do this. So your spore lands, and if there's water long enough, because it takes a while for this fungus to do this, it grows out its little hyphae and it dissolves the leaf cuticle and it dissolves away. It basically burns a way through, or digests a way through, and that's how it can get a hold. So if you can control the environment and make it so it's not, so that it dries out when it's trying to do this, if that spore germinates, it starts to make what's called the penetration peg. and then it gets dried out, done. That spore is done. It's never going to infect your plant. You do have to worry about more spores later, etc. But that's why, environment matters. That's why you often see in gardening advice like, improve airflow if you can. Powdery mildew, many different species. They're often crop specific. So one thing to note here is this powdery mildew on the bee balm is not going to jump over to be the powdery mildew on the squash. They're different species of powdery mildew. However, if conditions are conducive to powdery mildew landing on bee balm and taking off and being successful, they're probably also conducive to the other species landing on that crop or any of the other powdery mildew species that land on any of the other things. So I get people who are worried because they have powdery mildew on their lilacs and will it jump to their tomatoes or their squash? No. But if you see powdery mildew on your lilacs, you probably have an environment that's conducive to powdery mildew. So you need to start thinking about that. So that all gets to facilitating rapid drying. And because I say stuff like this way too much, I wrote a little article at MOFGA. You can look it up if you'd like. It's just making your garden less hospitable to disease. What are we talking about? But I'm going to give you the crib notes here. When we're talking about like tomatoes, I also get people asking about, should I prune tomatoes? How do you prune tomatoes? Well, here's what I do. I do space them out far enough so they're not too crowded in the row, but I don't want them to get super bushy and they're kind of a weedy plant. So you see that sucker growing at the leaf axil, and this you do have to know what's a leaflet versus an entire leaf on a tomato because they only grow off of the stem, not what looks like a stem, but it's actually just part of the leaf. Um, so that's another stem coming up there where the red arrow is pointing. And here's more. And I would take all of those. So whoop, clean that up. That's going to help be some airflow. Uh, you can see there's a little flea beetle damage down at the bottom. That will probably get infected later with some disease. And I will probably remove the leaf then, but I'm not worried about it now. I want many solar panels feeding my plant as I can, right? But if you're able, if you're on the home scale, that's one of the luxuries that you have as a gardener is that you can do a lot of things by hand. On a farm scale, they might do this for greenhouse tomatoes, which are higher value, but they probably wouldn't do it for field tomatoes, for example. And then how far do you go? I like to look for what is the first flower cluster. And then I will actually let a second leader come up. I like to have two stems. And so that's the one that I'll leave and I'll take everything else. And you can see that that sucker is naturally, the plant favors it. It makes a really, that's like the biggest sucker that the plant will make is always that first one below the first fruiting cluster. And you can see it's getting pretty bushy down there at the bottom on the left and on the right, the same plant. It's a lot more cleared out. It's going to let air move through faster. Water is going to evaporate a little bit faster. Will this prevent all disease? No, but it'll help. If disease shows up, it won't be as bad as it would have been otherwise. Um, the other thing missing here, is I would probably be mulching this, and that matters, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Biological controls, you know, we probably all know lady beetles are good for eating aphids. Green lacewings, the syrphid flies, like I talked about. There's lots of other natural predators and parasitoids. So there's some you can buy. There's maybe ethical dilemmas about whether you should be buying lady beetles or not because they're all collected from the wild. Uh, but like when people have aphids, I usually suggest, can you knock them back with like a really strong blast from your hose? Or maybe buy a insecticide soap and mix that up, get it sudsy, and then blast them off with the hose, and just give your natural predator population time to build up so that they can control them. And that almost always takes care of aphids. There's other biological controls for other diseases. Mexican bean beetle, you can introduce a parasitoid wasp. But if you've never had Mexican bean beetle, why would you worry about it, right? So it gets very crop specific and pest specific. In terms of like the bacterial biological controls, I say it can't hurt. Gosh, we're all hoping they'll work. So far, I haven't been convinced that they're worth the money. So I don't typically recommend people buy these that often. But if you're interested in it, they certainly can't hurt, and some of them may help, but it's just the evidence doesn't. I almost wish you just maybe use that money to buy some more compost, right? Improve your soil health and have healthier plants. Because so far, there's little evidence that they're doing that much, unfortunately. That's my short version of biological controls. That's something that could be a talk all on its own. So then we've done all of these other things in our hierarchy. We're getting up against the wall. We decided that it is a pest. It is going to be enough of a problem. We want to control them, or we really don't want that population building up so that because we don't want them to be as big of a problem next year. So we're going to maybe do a spray of some sort. There's the botanically based sprays. So if you've heard of neem, azadirachtin is the active ingredient that is from a plant, and it is a growth disruptor essentially. And so as plants or insects go from one state life stage to another, they often have to molt. And so if you have a pest that you want to stop before it gets to its adult stage, this might help with that. However, if your pest is adult grasshoppers, it won't do anything for them because they're not going to molt. And so it doesn't matter if you stop them from molting. So know your pest and know if your control is appropriate or not. Again, the pest reports are where I try to get that information out there for people. But of course, University of Maine Cooperative Extension has lots of information, et cetera. Uh, the other botanical spray that people often use is pyrethrin, and that's the active ingredient. The brand name is Pyganic in terms of what's approved for use on an organic growing. And that, like I said, is broad spectrum. Any insect it touches, it'll at least impair and maybe kill. So you don't want to spray it when bees are active or pollinators or other things that you want. You want it to only get in contact with your pest issue. It's sort of like yeah, it's and it potentially has health consequences for people. However, once it's been on a plant and it's dried off and it's been in the sunlight for a couple days, it's mostly broken down. But most folks don't want to mess with stuff if they don't have to. Any pesticide has some risk associated with it. And then last, we go to our synthetic chemicals, which some of the, synthetic, some of it's like a mined material, but then it's maybe been processed a little bit. So copper as a fungicide, sulfur is one of our better controls for the powdery mildews. Oils can control some diseases like powdery mildew, but don't apply sulfur and oil at the same time because you would actually cause more damage to your plant than the mildew would have. Um, Oils are also really good to smother really small, soft-bodied pests like aphids. Iron phosphate baits for slugs and snails. It sort of we want to control the environment, but if you're still getting them, then this is sort of your last ditch effort that would be allowed under rules for organic growing. And we're kind of through like our general talk, and I will get into some of our common pests and diseases and see if I will do a little speed round. So again, all right, here's tomatoes and maybe a potato thrown in there or two. Uh, is this all the same disease? No. Early blight up top, late blight down on the bottom left. Late blight's a big deal. Early blight's common. Everybody gets early blight. It can be a bigger deal. It can, in a bad year, early blight can be just as damaging if you don't do anything to control it. Septoria leaf spot can be managed similarly to early blight. I kind of throw these two in the same boat, even though they're not the same species, not the same disease. They behave similarly. Uh, you kind of get those concentric circles for early blight. These are the most common tomato diseases, these two probably. And when it gets bad, early blight starts to look like this. You lose your leaves, so you're not photosynthesizing. You don't have sugars going to your fruit anymore. You can still pick those fruit and they will ripen and they'll probably be fine, but not ideal. So it overwinters on crop debris. When that crop debris is on the soil surface, especially, and you get rain, the spores are going to splash off of that in the spring and land on your leaves. And so it can work its way up a plant. But also, once there's an infection in the area, a neighboring farm, a garden, once the plant is infected, it's going to make spores as well. And those spores can go windblown and they can arrive from farther away. So you want to control your overwintered population, reduce the amount that shows up, and so that the only time it does actually show up is when it's showing up on the wind later on. And the later you can hold it off, the more success you'll have. It needs leaf wetness. So you want to rotate, get away from that crop debris. You want to have a good, strong, healthy plant. Some people, like with a cherry tomato, just keep ripping off those lower infected leaves. And those things are so vigorous, they're just going to keep growing, and the new growth will probably be fine. Stake your plants so they're up, they catch the wind, they dry off better. Use drip irrigation, don't overhead water if you can help it. Mulch, and that helps because you're burying that crop debris. You're reducing soil that splashes up and lands on the plant. And so even if that soil doesn't have the crop debris in it, it's going to hold moisture on the plant longer, and it might have other diseases. And if you use tomato stakes year after year, disinfect them because the crop debris, like that little tiny fragment of a broken leaf, can be wedged on that plant, on that wooden stake in the cracks. So yeah, that's in my garden, and that's my sun golds. I don't prune those as heavily. I know they're eventually going to go down, but I also get sun golds all the way through into frost because they just grow so vigorously. I see somebody asking how to disinfect wooden stakes, and the easy way would be, anything like a tub, you want to soak them in some sort of disinfectant solution, whether that's bleach or Sanidate is a commercially available one. Late blight, very different beast. Anybody that's actually up in the county, I'm sure you're much more familiar with late blight because it's so important to potato growing. Um, that is one that does not overwinter here. And the classic symptoms are that white fuzzy sporulation. So, it's really important to know, do you have late blight or early blight? It's a whole different ball of wax in terms of, can you just kind of get by like I do with my sun golds? Or do you maybe need to deal with this and maybe like let somebody know so that the farmers in the area know? Because if you're the gardener that has late blight and then it spreads from you to everybody else, you might have some unhappy neighbors. It can get into fruit. This was the cause of the Irish potato famine. It is a big deal. So it doesn't overwinter here, except because our tomato plants are don't and our potato foliage doesn't overwinter. It needs a living host to survive. However, a potato is alive, and if that potato is infected and you plant an infected potato that's only minimally infected and you didn't notice or something, or you threw out your gnarly potatoes from your crop in the compost and then you let the compost potatoes do their own thing because everybody loves vegetables that grew out of the compost. Sometimes they're always the biggest and best. Well, don't let potatoes do it because you could be overwintering late blight. And as the name implies, it usually only shows up later in the season and it's less of a problem. However, if it were to overwinter and show up in the spring, and what happened in 2009, it didn't actually overwinter. It came to New England on tomato seedlings that were grown from an infected greenhouse down south, right? But either that was a really bad late blight year, and it's because it showed up early in the season and it had a chance to multiply within a field and then spread to other fields. Uh, So why do you need an IPM newsletter, the pest report emails, something like that? We will tell you where late blight is because you better believe people pay attention and it gets tracked and it gets mapped. So every time it hits a new county, that county gets lit up on this map. And extension folks and people like me email each other about it. And we send that out in the newsletters because we don't want people caught unawares. We also don't want people spraying for late blight when it's not actually even there. This one is less common for a home gardener. We won't go too long on this, but if you see yellowing on the surface of a leaf, but that sort of olive fuzzy sporulation on the bottom, that's called leaf mold. It's a pretty wild disease. It really just needs high humidity, so it's common in greenhouse situations, high tunnel growing. Um, and it's also totally preventable if you use a resistant variety. If you grow a tomato that's leaf mold resistant, you might get a spot here or there of one or two different types of leaf mold, but the really devastating leaf mold you don't have. Whereas if you have a susceptible variety next to it in the same greenhouse, that variety is loaded and eventually dies way earlier. So there are a couple diseases where it's an on-off switch. Do you have a resistant variety or not? And that's just traditional plant breeding that has allowed that resistance gene to be put into different varieties just by like careful traditional plant breeding. There is a new tomato disease, quote unquote new, that is hit Maine. It's similar conditions to leaf mold. It looks a lot like the other diseases we just talked about, right? Most folks probably don't need to worry about it, but I did give do a write-up, and this came out just in January. Um, it's working its way up the coast, probably with climate change. So if you're in southern Maine, warmer, more humid, you do any sort of covered growing, you really need to pay attention. Or just grow a resistant variety, and then you don't have to worry about it. If you're in Aroostook, it's probably not going to hit you for a little bit, but it might make its way up at some point. So just know that it's a thing, that it exists. Slugs. We could talk forever about slugs. There is a pest report about it. My short version is try to control the environment. They don't like to dry out. Um, Sorry for the military terminology, but if you think of your garden as something where you set up a defensible perimeter, rototill a swath all the way around the garden. They don't want to cross bare soil most of the time. And then deal with what's inside there, either hand remove, and if you can't get them all, slugs or snails, then maybe you use iron phosphate baits, Sluggo. Um, but you don't want to be you don't want to be overly reliant on that probably. So do it once, maintain the perimeter, and just watch to see if they're coming back in or not, right? Um, Basil downy mildew, this is another one, doesn't overwinter. Resistant varieties, this is not so much an on-off switch. You can get resistant varieties. That doesn't mean they'll never get downy mildew, but it'll be a lot harder for them to get downy mildew. And it's one that never used to hit the Northeast until, well, it's probably been 15 or 20 years now, but still, it has been spreading more and more. It's another one that gets mapped or talked about because it doesn't overwinter. Um, Powdery mildew, we talked about that. Again, you should need to know your disease. I get photos like this sent to me asking about the powdery mildew. If anybody grows a lot of zucchini, you probably recognize that that's just a zucchini leaf. That's just what they do. So is it a disease? Is it not? Just kind of remember, it's not always a problem. Uh, and also, I believe that's a resistant variety. Some of them have powdery mildew resistance, and that just makes everything easier. Spinach downy mildew, another greenhouse thing, probably, although I have seen it outdoors a tiny bit, but it's not usually a problem. It's more of covered growing, but it's been a growing problem. It's been an increasing problem for our commercial farmers that do fall and winter spinach. There's my email, Instagram, etc., the pest report, if folks want to reach out to me.